Hello, welcome. We're going to be looking at in this video is we're going to be looking at Australian context for Australian literature. And what we're going to be mainly looking at specifically is how a variety of external influences can influence a text, which has been composed by an Australian author is of Australian origins. And looking at the sorts of ideas, sorts of influences, sorts of styles which influence all Australian texts, whether they be novels, whether they be films, poems, and so on. It's important to note the sorts of characteristics that the Australian context, the Australian environment, and the Australian landscape has in all forms, not just its physical, but also its societies, its culture, and all the rest. And really recognize what influences these have on the construction of meaning and the types of texts that you may find based on a sort of a very rough sort of categorization of them. So really looking at the sorts of kinds of texts that you're going to find from Australian sources, from Australian authors, and their subject matter. That's what we're really going to be focusing on first of all. Okay, so Australian context. Now, the Australian context typically is, I guess, what people perceive us as overseas, the Crocodile Dundee style stereotype, when we're a lot more than that. We're much more diversified, much broader. And so we need to look beyond just the simple and simplistic stereotype that Australian culture is, and not suggest at all that any of Australia's texts have been influenced by this sort of representation of us. Now, it's basically what you need to do is you need to go much deeper into the stereotype, or than the stereotype for that matter. And as you study, you need to be mindful of the varied experiences in which influences Australian texts. So not all Australian authors are country people who live in the outback and sit on verandas. They are a variety of people who have a variety of influences. And not only influences in Australia, influences from overseas, and you also think about their perspectives, their motivations for writing, all the things that influence their texts are much broader than, I guess, a simple stereotype. And it's the same with any other text as well if you're looking at overseas authors. But when we're just looking at it from an Australian perspective, all right, it requires you to even look quite deeply what Australian culture is and actually understanding what that idea is. Understanding what Australian context actually entails and the sorts of experiences that can contribute to a context or a context of an Australian text. Okay, so let's look at some context. To start with, we've got probably the obvious one, which is the bush. As in the bush stories, the bush ballads of authors such as Lawson and Patterson. The very typical style of Australian text, as I guess many people perceive it. You also have history and war, as in stories which chronograph, should I say, not only Australia's history, but the Anzac spirit, Anzacs in general, our warfare, our experience basically for history. And again, it's a very important part of Australian literature because it not only chronicles different kinds of stories, it also chronicles the history from perspectives of those who have been there, and even if they're not necessarily non-fiction stories, they're ones that at least allow us to get some sort of feeling for what it would be like to be there, so they're important as well. The cosmopolitan, as in the modern text, so the ones that have been written that reflect Australia as it is now, people living in cities, people living normal everyday suburban lives. There are a number of texts now which really go into the nuts and bolts of that and look at really our cosmopolitan way of life, as opposed to, I guess, the classical bush ballad fantasy that we always get sort of thrown in with. The migrant experience. Now, the migrant experience comes in a couple of parts, and we'll go into them in a bit later, but basically because Australia is a nation full of migrants, full of immigrants, a number of stories are written by a number of authors, of course, that chronicle that experience. And the main ones we'll be looking at in terms of the migrant experience, the ones you'll be probably looking at, the ones which basically are after World War II. So after the British, essentially the British migration phase has sort of ended, the onset of further European migration, and then finally when the White Australia policy was abolished, immigration from Asia and Africa and the rest of the world. So it's a fairly broad experience, and it's a very broad sort of environment that you'll be looking at there. And finally, the Indigenous experience. Now, we're not going to be covering the Indigenous experience so much in these videos because we have a separate series for that. But what we will be looking at is sort of just generally how it works into the overall landscape for Australian context and Australian culture. Okay, so what do you need to know? Well, first of all, for any Australian text, you need to know about these things. So first of all, you need to know about the time it was written and when it was set. Okay, Australia has changed a lot in the last even 100 years, even the last 50 years, even the last 30 years. So you need to be very conscious about the time it was written and the time it's also set in, because obviously not all texts are set in the era that it's written in. So some may be set before, some may be set after. So it's very important that when you look at it, you look at the time it was set and when it was written. You need to look at the community, as in what perspective was, what community group did the author come from. Now, when you say community group, all right, even if you're looking in the context of a city like Sydney, for instance, not every community is the same. You have different kinds of communities and different kinds of perspectives within those communities. So the values, beliefs, and locations of those communities portrayed in particular texts are quite influential, and they do differ even between suburbs. So you're not expected to go in and give a suburb by suburb sort of rundown of what sort of people and what sort of cultures exist. Be very mindful of the author and basically the kinds of people who are influential in an author's, in a composer's storytelling, and look how what they present, what they compose is representative of that community they come from. And finally, the author themselves, as in the author's biography and the author's background, as you would be when you're looking at any text, having a look at the author's biography and looking, I guess, at their Australian experience and what they're trying to represent. All right, because they will be different. And certainly if you look at particularly something like the bush ballads, for instance, everyone thinks of them as being classic Australian sort of literature. But the authors at the time were writing in a period in Australia's history where Australia was a colony of Britain, not a country itself. And so a lot of what represented Australia was essentially a giant extension of England, of Britain. And whereas what we look at it now, we look at it in terms of nationhood, in terms of patriotism, all the rest. So the biography and the background and basically the things that influence a text are quite crucial as well for you to be looking at. Okay, let's look at some of those categories a little bit more in depth. So let's start with, I guess, the classic one, which is the bush, which refers to, as you probably know, the rural areas in the outback. Okay, so Australia's country lifestyle. And it can also refer to bush ballads, because that's generally what we're thinking of when we're looking at the Australian bush in terms of its literature. Bush ballads, short stories and poems from authors such as Banjo, Patterson, Henry Lawson, and so on. And in terms of what you'd look at it now, you probably look at more in terms of music and poetry as much as you would look at it in terms of those things as well, although there are still novels being published and news stories being written about the Australian bush. But really its origins is sort of that colonialist origins that we get when we're looking and when we're considering what Australian bush is. Now, today Australian bush literature has declined. I mean, it is pretty much due to the fact that we now all live in cities and the bush is hardly relevant. I mean, we often like to write fantasies about the bush because it's sort of seen as a simpler, purer lifestyle, but really the nature of it, I guess, Australia being a country that rides on the sheep's back, as it used to be called, one that used to be, I guess, controlled by those who lived out in the country and ran farms and all of those things, are now being basically, they're making way for stories about Australia's modern cities, because really the bush has been done. And while you'll still be looking at it and you'll be looking at the context in which these stories have been written, obviously, if you're looking at it in terms of the context of Australian literature, you'll be looking at the modern one. Okay, history. Now, many of these stories basically reflect the European colonisation of Australia. When we do mention history, we do mention, I guess, the European history, because for really the last 200 years, the majority of the history of Australia has been, I guess, documented by Europeans, those who have European origins or are essentially of that sort of background. So the majority of the stories that you'll be looking at will be focused on European sort of colonisation and development of national identity from those origins. Now, of course, you'll be thinking, okay, well, we've moved on from that now, and we have. And when we're looking at a more modernist point of view, we'll be looking at it from a number of different perspectives. But in terms of Australia's history, and if we're looking at history that goes anywhere beyond about 50 years ago, we're looking at this distinctively European history, and then also we'll be looking at the Indigenous Australian history as well. Although the experiences and the sorts of stories that we do tell about that are still very much clouded by, I guess, the European colonisation. Now, many stories of Australia refer to basically any one of these things. The British convict settlement, the colonisation, and essentially World War I as being significant nation builders. And you can also throw in things like the Gold Rush and Federation as well. But generally speaking, it's sort of stories that tell about how Australia was born, how it was formed, how it was initially a whole heap of parts and then became a whole. Of course, that's what we're looking at in terms of if we're looking at Australia as an overall context, as in it becoming what it is, we look at it in terms of how it was built. Now, Australia is relatively young compared to a lot of other established nations of the world. Australia's history, at least European-wise, doesn't go back thousands of years. So the stories that come with it are only fairly recent and mainly how essentially the lifestyle of, let's just say, the 19th century contributed to basically the lifestyle we have now in the 21st. We must also basically refer to Australia after World War II. Now, this moves on from the nation-building aspect and looks at, I guess, our more modern history. So the baby boomers, the female and Aboriginal rights movements, and the end of the White Australia policy, to name a couple of important events that have occurred since the end of World War II. And even World War II itself has a number of stories which are quite influential to Australian culture. And certainly if you're talking about the Australian context and the Australian meaning, then you'll be looking at those things too. All right, let's move on. Looking at the cosmopolitan side of Australia's culture. And basically it refers to life in Australian cities and reflects more modern Australian society. So they're ones that are going to be a lot more recognisable to you. Now, most of them have been sort of fairly recent sorts of texts and incorporate a number of different perspectives. One thing which isn't written then is multiculturalism, and certainly modern cosmopolitan Australian texts refer to that multiculturalism and certainly that that connection with a number of different values and attitudes. Now, they basically, many of them feature themes of identity and belonging and focus on cultures and communities. So as I mentioned, that multiculturalism comes in. But really sort of trying to understand, because Australia is a constantly shifting landscape, and particularly culturally, where in the last sort of 30 years or so we've really undertaken a huge cultural shift, then a lot of Australian texts that are written now are about basically finding an identity amongst that, because there is a debate that Australia's identity is sort of one that is very hard to define, as in we don't really know who we are. And so a lot of stories do explore that and basically look at this idea of identity and belonging into communities, especially as being diverse as they are. All right, now the Migrant Experience, now there are a number of these stories in the HSC curriculum, and certainly you will come across a few of these, and basically refers to Australia's cultural history of new arrivals and immigrants to Australia. And they can be grouped into two broad categories, and we're going to put them into two broad categories in this regard. First of all, the post-World War II, as in when the displaced Europeans came to Australia, and the stories reflecting displacement and finding a new identity. So these are the stories that sort of go from about 1945 to about the early 1980s. And really what they're about, well, pretty much as I said, at the end of World War II, when most of Europe was lying in ruins after the war, many Europeans had a choice whether or not to rebuild or to move somewhere else, and a lot of them took up the opportunity, particularly as Australia was sort of calling out for more people to come live here, to get on a boat and head over to Australia. And when they did come to Australia, there was a lot of tension and conflict between the new European arrivals and the existing Australian settlers because of particularly assimilation and trying to get people who didn't speak English, which was pretty outrageous at the time that people didn't speak English, because let's face it, Australia up until that point was an entirely English-speaking nation. And basically there was that conflict where they tried to forge a new identity in a land that sort of really wasn't theirs yet. So it basically, those sorts of stories are the original, I guess, immigration stories that we're looking at now. Of course, if we're looking at them in terms of more modern stories, we're looking at multiculturalism and the refugee experience, as in centering on the changing Australian communities as new arrivals and the stories of those people who have arrived. So you'll be seeing a lot more, particularly in terms of other texts that you look at, and if you look at a lot of modern Australian stories, they are about that. They're about coming from different parts of the world and finding a home in Australia and what that means and what that entails. So a lot of that, again, it has to do with identity and belonging. Those are the two main themes at the heart of each one. And really it's just about sort of finding that identity, fitting into the Australian identity, and really feeling like they belong as well. Okay, so let's look at Indigenous texts. Now, a lot of Indigenous texts are basically about identity and family, and it's a very narrow-minded view if you're looking at them just in terms of culture. Now, the reason I say that is because I guess there is that sort of presumption among many people who read Aboriginal texts that it's going to be all about culture and connection with spirituality and I guess their lifestyle, which, yes, they're about those sorts of things. But there's also a much deeper human story involved, and that's the real part that you should be looking at quite closely, because these aren't just stories about people who have had a sort of, I guess, a difficult life. These are people who have lost their entire identities, their entire ways of being, and essentially a lot of these stories are about them trying to reclaim that. So trying to reclaim who they are, trying to reclaim their family. A lot of these stories also refer to essentially the stolen generations. And the reason why so many texts focus on this is because there are so many stories to be told on the issue. And certainly when we're looking at it in terms of the journey towards reconciliation, and certainly looking at the steps sort of taken over the last 5 to 10 years or so, we're looking at it in terms of how those stories have contributed to what we now know, and to what we can say about what happened in that unfortunate part of Australia's history. And certainly a part of Australia's history which is quite dark, and certainly it stops it being swept under the carpet, so to speak. And the other thing that it also, a lot of these stories look at, and particularly if you're looking at it in terms of context, you'd be looking in terms of context of land rights and conflict with European settlers, as in not only the conflict with European settlers upon first arrival, but the conflict in terms of having just basic civil rights, which a lot of Aboriginal citizens didn't really gain until the late 60s, when the Aboriginal rights movement came through. And it was sort of this disparity, this lack of connection with their own land, which really a lot of these stories are about. And certainly because of the actions of governments at the time, we have a lot of stories about a loss of identity and a loss of family. And certainly these stories are quite powerful in that regard, and you should be really looking at them in terms of how they powerfully communicate loss, and certainly if you're looking at an appreciation for the kinds of experiences that a lot of Indigenous communities have had to sort of grow with, and the sorts of scars as well that are sort of maintained through even now. So it might seem like a text that you may not necessarily identify if you're not Indigenous, but once you read it, you can find similar sorts of traits that anyone can identify with. Okay, so in summary, Australian contexts vary. You're not going to find the same story each time. And if you're looking at Australian stories as being representative of Australia, there are a number of definitions of Australia that you need to look at. They have their own identity, and that's what I basically was sort of getting at before, is that every text has its own distinct identity and reflects its own distinct part of the community. So whether it be a small or a large part of Australia, each part has its own identity, and one that different people can identify with it to differing degrees, even those living here and certainly those living overseas would. And finally, they represent Australian communities and values, and that's the overall importance of what Australian texts do. They represent Australia as it is, and as a sort of a historical chronograph in terms of how it's evolved, how it's grown, how Australian culture has sort of managed to permeate all aspects of daily life, and how it basically is still something significant. It might not seem significant at times, but it is quite a significant thing, and certainly you can see that for Australian texts. But otherwise, that's it for the context of Australian literature. So until next time, I'll see you later.